The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and diesel fuel, the kind of scent that clings to concrete walls in forgotten corners of airfields where careers go to die. Major Alara Voss sat in the back row, her flight suit faded at the elbows, watching younger pilots lean forward with hungry eyes as the operations officer sketched red circles on the map of the disputed border region. She'd stopped leaning forward years ago. Nobody noticed when she slipped out early anymore. The base had a way of making people invisible, especially those who'd flown too many missions that never made it into the highlight reels. Outside, the tarmac shimmered in the heat, and she could see the row of F-35s gleaming like jewelry under the midday sun. Her boots scraped against the asphalt as she walked toward the maintenance hangars, the forgotten part of the base where paint peeled and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. The alert came at 400 hours, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Alara was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bunk with a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She'd learned to sleep in 15-minute intervals during her tour over Kandahar, back when the A-10 Warthog was still considered a frontline asset, before the brass decided slow and ugly didn't photograph well for recruitment videos. The loudspeaker crackled with static before the words came through, all available pilots to the operations center. She pulled on her flight suit, the fabric soft and worn, and noticed her hands weren't shaking. They never did anymore. The base was chaos when she arrived, pilots stumbling out of their quarters, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Someone had kicked over a coffee maker in the ready room. The operations officer looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. "We have a situation," he said, his voice stripped of its usual swagger. "Ground forces are pinned down in the Karvesh Valley. Heavy armor, anti-air systems, the works. They need close air support, and they need it 30 minutes ago." The young pilots exchanged glances, their faces tight with something that could have been fear or excitement or both. The F-35s were magnificent machines, built for speed and stealth and precision strikes from altitude. But the valley was a maze of narrow canyons where radar signatures didn't matter and low-altitude maneuverability meant everything. The operations officer's eyes scanned the room, hesitating on faces he recognized, skipping over the one he'd learned to ignore. Alara stood in the doorway, waiting, already knowing how this would unfold. They always realized too late. The valley had claimed 3 helicopters in the last 18 months, and the satellite imagery showed why. Sheer rock walls rose like tombstones on either side of the narrow corridor, creating a kill box where traditional air support became a death sentence. The enemy had learned to position their weapons in cave systems and reinforced bunkers, waiting for aircraft to commit to the approach. Ground forces called it the grinder. Pilots called it career suicide. The operations officer's voice cracked slightly as he explained the tactical situation, his finger tracing the route on the digital map that looked more like a canyon than a valley. The young pilots leaned back in their chairs, the hunger in their eyes replaced by calculation. Their aircraft were worth $80 million each, designed for engagements that happened at 30,000 feet, not 300. Someone cleared their throat. Another checked their watch. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. "I'll go." Alara's voice cut through the tension, flat and matter-of-fact, the way someone might volunteer to take out the trash. Heads turned. A few of the younger pilots looked confused, as if trying to place her face to remember where they'd seen her before. The operations officer's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, relief, something that might have been guilt. "Major Voss," he said slowly, using her rank like he just remembered it existed. "Your aircraft is—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Your aircraft is obsolete. Your aircraft is a relic. Your aircraft belongs in a museum." She saved him the trouble. "In Hangar 7, she said, "fueled and armed if your maintenance crews haven't completely forgotten how to load her guns." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. The operations officer nodded, grateful for the lifeline she'd thrown him, for the solution to a problem he hadn't wanted to solve. "Brief in 10 minutes, he said. "Get her ready." Alara walked across the tarmac with the sunrise breaking behind her, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost too vivid to be real. The F-35s sat silent in their revetments, sleek and modern, like sculptures of what air power was supposed to look like. She passed them without a second glance. Hangar 7 sat at the edge of the flight line, its doors closed, its exterior streaked with rust and oil stains that no amount of pressure washing could remove. The padlock clicked open under her fingers, and she put her shoulder against the door, feeling the resistance of metal that hadn't moved in weeks. Inside, the darkness smelled like hydraulic fluid and old ammunition. She found the lights and flipped them on. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat waiting in the shadows, ugly and brutal and absolutely beautiful. Its nose was long and blunt, built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed its spine. The twin engines sat high on the fuselage, designed to keep running even when everything else was shot to hell. The titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights. Someone had painted kill marks along the nose, a row of small silhouettes that documented missions from another era. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets under her palm. "Hello, old friend," she whispered. "Time to wake up." The crew chief found her in the cockpit, running through pre-flight checks with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Reeve was old enough to remember when the A-10 was the undisputed king of close air support, back when the Cold War was still cold, and Soviet tank divisions were the nightmare scenario that kept generals awake at night. He climbed up the ladder with a clipboard in one hand and a concerned expression on his weathered face. He said carefully, "She's been sitting for a while. Engines are good, weapon systems check out, but the hydraulics might be sluggish until we get some heat in them." Alara didn't look up from the instrument panel. "What's the cannon count?" she asked. Reeve consulted his clipboard. "Full load, 1,100 rounds of 30mm. Also have Mavericks on stations 3 and 9 and a full complement of flares and chaff." He paused. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's the target package?" She finished her checklist and looked at him, her expression unreadable. Close air support in the Karvesh Valley, mixed armor and infantry dug in and well defended. Ground forces are taking casualties. The color drained from Reeve's face. He'd heard the stories. Everyone had. The briefing was shorter than usual, stripped of the usual bravado and tactical optimism that accompanied most mission planning. The forward air controller on the ground was a captain named Rodriguez, and his voice over the secure comm channel had the hollow quality of someone who'd been awake too long and seen too much. "Warhawk 27, this is Anvil 16. We are danger close with enemy armor. Repeat, danger close. We have wounded that need immediate evacuation, but we cannot extract under current fire. Request immediate air support, over." Alara copied down the coordinates, her handwriting precise and efficient. The operations officer stood beside the map table, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Major, the valley approach is extremely hazardous. Enemy air defense is active and concentrated. If you take fire, you are cleared to break off and return to base. No heroics. Understood." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too many young men die because someone broke off an attack run. "Understood," she said, but they both knew it was a lie. She would either complete the mission or she wouldn't come back. Those were the only two options that mattered. The walk back to Hangar 7 felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with the weight of what came next. The cockpit of an A-10 is not designed for comfort. It's designed for survival. Alara strapped herself in, feeling the familiar embrace of the ejection seat harness, the way the controls fell under her hands exactly where they were supposed to be. Reeve appeared at the cockpit rail one last time, his face serious. "Give 'em hell, Gravedigger," he said, using her old call sign from Afghanistan. The name had stuck after her 6th mission, when she'd stayed on station for 3 hours, making gun run after gun run while her wingman limped home with a damaged engine. Someone had joked that she was digging graves at 500 rounds per minute. The name became legend. She gave him a tight smile. "Always do, Chief." The canopy came down with a hydraulic hiss, sealing her inside. Engine start was smooth, the twin turbofans spooling up with a rising whine that built into a steady roar. The tower cleared her for immediate departure, no traffic, no delays. As she taxied out of the hangar, she could see pilots and ground crews stopping their work to watch. The A-10 silhouette was unmistakable, prehistoric, a reminder of a different kind of warfare. She didn't wave. She was already gone. Takeoff was brutal and efficient, the A-10 clawing into the sky with the same graceless determination that characterized everything about the aircraft. Alara kept the climb steep, gaining altitude quickly, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. The morning sun was fully up now, turning the desert below into a patchwork of brown and gold. She switched to the tactical frequency and keyed the mic. Anvil 16, Warhawk 27 is airborne and en route to your position. ETA 12 minutes. Send situation update over. The response came back immediately, Rodriguez's voice tight with controlled urgency. Warhawk 27, situation is deteriorating. We have 4 T-72 tanks in defilade positions, approximately 200 meters northeast of our position. They're walking fire onto our lines. We also have multiple anti-air systems active in the area. ZSU-23-4 and possible MA and PADS. Recommend high approach and standoff weapons over. Alara looked out at the horizon where the mountains rose like jagged teeth. Negative Anvil, standoff won't cut it in that terrain. I'm coming in low. Mark your position with smoke, green smoke. I'll be there in 10. Warhawk 27 out. There was a pause on the other end long enough that she thought he might argue. Then, Roger, Warhawk, green smoke, will be ready. Anvil 16 out. The Karvesh Valley appeared in the distance. A dark slash cut through the mountain range, exactly as ugly as the briefing materials had suggested. Alara descended to 5,000 feet, keeping her speed steady, her hands light on the controls. The A-10 was not a fast aircraft, but it was stable, and in this kind of terrain, stability mattered more than speed. She could see smoke rising from the valley floor now, black and thick, the kind that came from burning vehicles and ammunition stores. Her radar warning receiver was quiet, but that wouldn't last. The enemy knew American air power, and they'd be waiting for her. She armed the cannon, feeling the subtle vibration through the airframe as the GAU-8 rotated into firing position. 7 barrels, each one capable of spitting out uranium-depleted rounds at 4,000 rounds per minute. The Air Force had built the A-10 around this gun, designing the aircraft to be a flying weapons platform that could take punishment and keep fighting. She'd proven that theory more times than she cared to remember. Anvil 16, Warhawk 27, I have your smoke. Beginning attack run. Keep your heads down, over. Rodriguez's response was almost drowned out by the sound of incoming fire. Roger, Warhawk, cleared hot. Godspeed. The valley walls rose on either side as she dropped below 3,000 feet, the rock faces close enough that she could see individual boulders and scrub vegetation clinging to impossible angles. This was the moment when most pilots pulled up, when survival instinct overrode tactical necessity. Alara pushed the stick forward. The ground forces were clustered behind a low ridge, their position marked by the green smoke that drifted upward in the wind. She could see the tanks now, 4 dark shapes positioned in a semicircle, their guns elevated and firing. Each muzzle flash was a small burst of orange light, followed seconds later by the impact explosion somewhere near the American position. She rolled the A-10 slightly, lining up her approach vector, compensating for wind and altitude and the natural drift of the aircraft. The heads-up display painted the scene in green wireframe geometry, overlaying targeting information across her field of vision. She selected the lead tank, the one closest to the friendly positions, and waited until the firing solution locked. The world narrowed to the sight picture and the trigger under her right index finger. Guns, 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 she called, more from habit than necessity. The GAU-8 opened up, and the entire aircraft shuddered. The sound of the A-10's cannon is something that can't be adequately described to someone who's never heard it. It's not a machine gun sound, not the rapid chatter of smaller weapons. It's deeper, more primal, a continuous buzzsaw roar that seems to tear the air itself apart. From the ground, it arrives a split second after the impacts, the sound lagging behind the supersonic rounds. Alara held the trigger for 3 seconds, sending 90 rounds downrange, each one the size of a milk bottle, each one capable of punching through tank armor. She watched the tracers walk across the ground, saw the lead tank erupt in a shower of sparks and smoke as the depleted uranium rounds found their mark. Secondary explosions blossomed from the turret as ammunition cooked off. She pulled up hard, banking right, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat. The radar warning receiver screamed to life, multiple threat indicators lighting up across the spectrum. They'd found her. Anti-aircraft fire began to fill the sky, lines of tracer fire reaching up like deadly fingers, trying to pluck her from the air. She jinked left, then right, throwing the A-10 into a series of violent maneuvers that would have torn the wings off a less robust aircraft. Alara came around for her second pass, the valley walls blurring past in her peripheral vision. The remaining 3 tanks had shifted position, spreading out, making themselves harder targets. Smart. They'd been trained by professionals. She selected the second tank, the one furthest from the friendlies, and lined up her approach. This time they were waiting for her. The ZSU-23-4 opened up from a concealed position to her left, 4 barrels rotating in sequence, pumping 23 rounds into the air at a rate that filled the sky with metal. She felt impacts along the left wing, heard the distinctive thunk-thunk-thunk of rounds punching through aluminum and composite. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping in System 2, minor damage to the left aileron. The A-10 kept flying. That was the point. She squeezed the trigger again, walking her fire onto the second tank. The cannon's recoil slowed the entire aircraft, the firing impulse strong enough to decrease her airspeed by 10 knots. The tank exploded, its turret lifting off the chassis and tumbling through the air like a thrown toy. Warhawk 2-7, Anvil 1-6, good hits, 2 tanks destroyed. Break left, you have AAA at your 6. Rodriguez's voice was urgent but clear. The sky was full of lead and fire and death. Alara broke hard left, feeling the airframe groan under the stress, pushing the A-10 to the edge of its flight envelope. More impacts stitched across the right engine, and the temperature gauge spiked into the red. Engine fire warning light illuminated, bright and insistent. She pulled the fire suppression handle, felt the aircraft shudder as the system dumped chemicals into the engine compartment. The fire light stayed on for 3 seconds, then finally went dark. One engine running, hydraulics compromised, warning lights across the panel like a Christmas tree. She still had 2 tanks to kill and a cannon with 800 rounds remaining. The math was simple. She rolled inverted and pulled the nose down, diving back toward the valley floor. This run would be different. She was coming in from the opposite direction, using the sun at her back, forcing the enemy gunners to fire into the glare. Old tactics from old wars, but gravity and geometry didn't change with technology. The third tank was pulling back, trying to find cover behind a rocky outcrop. She caught it halfway through its maneuver, exposed and vulnerable. The cannon sang its terrible song again, and the tank died, flames erupting from every hatch and vision port. The fourth tank commander was either very brave or very stupid because he didn't retreat. Instead, his tank surged forward, charging toward the American position in a last desperate attempt to break through. Alara saw what he was trying to do, saw the gap in the ridge line that would give him a direct line of fire into the cluster of wounded and pinned down soldiers. Rodriguez saw it too. Warhawk, tank in the open, danger close, he's coming right at us. She was already lining up her shot, but the angle was wrong, the geometry impossible. She was too high, too far out, and by the time she could come around for another pass, the tank would be in among the friendly forces. There wouldn't be a clean shot. The decision took less than a second. She dove. The A-10 dropped like a stone, nose pointed almost straight down, airspeed climbing past 300 knots. The stall warning system blared in her headset. The radar altimeter counted down the distance to the ground in rapid descending numbers. 1,500 feet. 1,000. 700. The The tank filled her vision, growing larger, its gun turret rotating toward the American position. She fired from 400 feet, almost point-blank range for an aircraft, the cannon rounds tearing downward at a near-vertical angle. The tank exploded so close beneath her that she flew through the fireball, felt the heat wash over the canopy, saw flames licking past her wingtips. She pulled back on the stick with everything she had, both hands wrapped around the grip, arms straining against the G-forces that tried to push her through the bottom of the seat. The A-10 clawed its way out of the dive, the single working engine screaming in protest, the damaged wing flexing in ways that wings were never meant to flex. She cleared the ridge line by less than 50 feet, so close that she could see the expressions on the faces of the soldiers below: shock, awe, disbelief. The valley walls rushed past on either side. She gained altitude slowly, painfully, the aircraft responding to her inputs with the sluggish reluctance of something that had been hurt badly. The engine temperature was climbing again. More warning lights. The hydraulic pressure in System 1 was dropping now too. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, thick with emotion. Warhawk 27, Anvil 16, all threats neutralized. You cleared them out. You beautiful crazy. Static cut him off as she climbed higher, leaving the valley behind. The sky opened up above her, vast and blue and mercilessly beautiful. The flight back to base took 23 minutes that felt like hours. Alara nursed the damaged A-10 through the air with the delicate touch of someone coaxing a wounded animal to keep moving. The right engine was running at 60% power, the temperature gauge hovering just below the red line. She'd shut down the damaged left engine completely, feathering the propeller to reduce drag. The hydraulic systems were operating on emergency backup, which meant every control input took twice as much effort and responded half as quickly. She ran through emergency procedures in her head, reviewing the steps for a single-engine landing, calculating fuel consumption and distance remaining. The numbers were tight but manageable. The base appeared in the distance, a small cluster of buildings and runways surrounded by miles of empty desert. She called the tower, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Tower, Warhawk 27, 15 miles out, single-engine hydraulic failure requesting priority landing. The response was immediate. Warhawk 27, Tower, roger. You are cleared for straighten approach, runway 27. Emergency equipment is standing by. Wind 070 at 8 knots. She acknowledged and began her descent, dropping through 5,000 feet, then 3, lining up with the runway centerline that stretched out before her like a narrow ribbon of salvation. The landing was controlled chaos, the A-10 touching down hard and fast, the single engine roaring as she deployed the thrust reverser. The aircraft wanted to pull to the left, the asymmetric thrust trying to drag her off the runway. She fought it with rudder and differential braking, feeling the tires bite into the concrete, feeling the aircraft slow from 150 knots to 100 to 80 to 60. Fire trucks and ambulances raced alongside, keeping pace, ready to respond if the landing turned into a catastrophe. It didn't. She rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway, exactly where she was supposed to be, and shut down the remaining engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, breathing slowly and deliberately. Her hands started to shake now that it was over, the adrenaline finding its outlet. She allowed herself 30 seconds, then unstrapped and climbed out. Chief Reeve was the first one to reach her, his face a mixture of relief and professional assessment as he took in the damage to the aircraft. "Ma'am, you brought her home." Alara looked back at the A-10, at the holes punched through the wings, the scorched engine nacelle, the hundreds of small scars that documented the battle. "She brought me home," she corrected. "I just hung on." The debriefing lasted 2 hours and covered every detail of the mission from takeoff to landing. The operations officer asked questions, took notes, reviewed gun camera footage that captured the destruction of all 4 tanks in grainy black and white. Other pilots drifted in to watch, standing in the back of the room, silent and attentive. When Alara described the final attack run, The near-vertical dive that should have ended in a smoking crater. The room went completely still. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else whispered something about minimum altitude. The operations officer paused the footage on a frame that showed the A-10 pulling out of the dive with less than 100 feet of clearance. Major Voss, he said slowly, this was an extraordinary piece of flying. Reckless by every definition in the book, but extraordinary. She met his gaze without flinching. Ground forces needed close air support, sir. I provided it. He nodded, closed his folder, and stood. Rodriguez's unit is requesting a commendation. They want you recognized for saving their lives, all 18 of them. Alara shrugged. I just did the job. The operations officer smiled slightly. That's exactly what Rodriguez said you'd say. The room cleared slowly, pilots filing out, several of them nodding to her as they passed. Recognition without words. Respect earned the hard way. The bar on base was technically for officers only, but the rules were flexible after missions that mattered. Alara sat alone at a corner table, nursing a beer she hadn't really wanted, watching the young pilots celebrate at the bar. They were loud and confident, full of themselves and their expensive aircraft and their perfect safety records. She didn't blame them. She'd been young once too. Mind if I join you? She looked up to find a lieutenant colonel she didn't recognize, his uniform crisp, his bearing that of someone who spent more time behind desks than in cockpits. She gestured to the empty chair. He sat down, set his own beer on the table, and extended his hand. Tom Fletcher, I work in acquisitions and program management. She shook his hand briefly. Alara Voss, I fly the ugly plane. He laughed at that, a genuine sound. I saw the footage, he said. I've been trying to phase out the A-10 program for 3 years. Convince Congress it's outdated, that we need to redirect funding to newer platforms. He took a drink. And then you go and pull a stunt like today. Alara raised an eyebrow. A stunt? Fletcher shook his head quickly. Poor choice of words. What I mean is, you just reminded everyone why that aircraft exists. You proved something that can't be measured in data sheets and performance specs. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the younger pilots toast each other, their voices carrying across the bar. Fletcher spoke again, his voice quieter. How long have you been flying A-10s? Alara thought about it. 15 years, give or take. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, various rotations in Europe and Asia, 700 combat hours. The number hung in the air between them. Fletcher nodded slowly. And they parked you in Hangar 7, maintenance duty and occasional proficiency flights. It wasn't a question. That's the job, Alara said simply. Aircraft gets old, pilot gets old, Air Force moves on. Nature of the business. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, studying her. What was your call sign in Afghanistan? She smiled slightly, the first real smile since the mission. Gravedigger. I had a tendency to stay on station longer than recommended, make gun runs when everyone else had gone Winchester and headed home. Someone joked that I was digging graves at 500 rounds per minute. Name stuck. Fletcher raised his beer in a small salute. To Gravedigger, then. May your aircraft never get the retirement it deserves. They drank to that, and in that moment the distance between desk officer and combat pilot seemed less insurmountable than before. The news spread faster than Alara expected. By the following morning, half the base had seen the gun camera footage, and the other half had heard the story secondhand. She found herself stopped in the hallways, thanked by people she'd never met, questioned by junior pilots who wanted to know details that weren't in the official reports. She answered their questions politely but without elaboration, uncomfortable with the attention. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rodriguez. You have 18 brothers for life. Say the word and we'll walk through fire for you. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you. She read it twice, then saved it to a folder she kept for messages that mattered. The maintenance hangar was busy when she arrived to check on the A-10's repair status. Chief Reeve had the aircraft partially disassembled. Sections of wing and fuselage opened up to reveal the internal damage. The holes looked worse up close, ragged tears in metal that should have been catastrophic. Reeve saw her approaching and waved her over. Ma'am, you want the good news or the bad news? Alara crossed her arms. Start with the bad. He gestured to the engine. This one's done. Complete rebuild required, probably easier to just swap it for a new unit. Left hydraulic system needs replacement, several control cables are frayed, and we found stress fractures in two wing spars. He paused. Good news is she's fixable. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Alara ran her hand along the damaged fuselage, feeling the rough edges of torn metal. She took a beating, Reeve nodded. That she did, but she brought you home, that's what the hog does. He pulled out a small fragment of metal, twisted and deformed. Found this lodged in the armor plate behind your seat, 23mm round, probably from that ZSU. Another 6 inches and it would have punched right through. He handed it to her, the metal still warm from being recently extracted. She turned it over in her fingers, this small piece of death that had missed her by the width of a hand. Keep it, Reeves said. Reminder that someone upstairs likes you. She pocketed the fragment and looked back at the aircraft, this ugly, brutal, beautiful machine that had carried her through hell and brought her home. Get her fixed, Chief. Something tells me we're not done yet. Reeve grinned. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. They stood together in the hangar, surrounded by the controlled chaos of repair work, and for the first time in years, Alara felt like she belonged. The weeks that followed brought changes that rippled through the base like stones dropped in still water. The A-10 was moved from Hangar 7 to the primary maintenance facility, given priority status for repairs. Alara was reassigned from maintenance duty to active flight status, her name added back to the rotation roster. The younger pilots who had ignored her before now sought her out, asking questions about close air support tactics, about flying in hostile environments, about making the hard calls when the mission went sideways. She taught them what she could, sharing lessons learned in blood and fire, explaining that technology was a tool, but judgment was everything. Fletcher appeared again, this time with a small group of officers from the Pentagon, all of them wanting to tour the hangar, see the legendary A-10 that had become the center of a minor bureaucratic earthquake. The footage of her mission had made its way up the chain of command, viewed by generals and civilian officials, sparking debates about capability gaps and the true cost of retiring proven platforms. Alara watched from a distance as they examined the aircraft, pointing at the battle damage, taking photographs, engaged in animated discussions about firepower and survivability. She didn't care about their debates. She cared about the mission, about the soldiers on the ground who needed support. Rodriguez came to visit on a Saturday afternoon, driving 8 hours from his base just to shake her hand in person. He was younger than she expected, maybe 30, with tired eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd spent too much time in bad places. They met in the parking lot outside the base exchange, both of them in civilian clothes, both of them carrying the invisible weight that came with combat experience. Major Voss, he said, extending his hand. Captain Rodriguez. I had to come thank you in person. They shook hands and she could feel the strength in his grip, the controlled intensity. How are your men? She asked. He smiled, but there was pain behind it. 18 souls walked out of that valley because of you. 3 of them wouldn't have made it another hour. The medics said the shrapnel wounds were bad, really bad. We got them evacuated as soon as the LZ was secure. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've called for air support maybe 24 times in my career. Usually it's fast movers dropping bombs from altitude gone before the smoke clears. What you did was different. You stayed. You fought for us. Alara looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. It's the job, she said quietly. Rodriguez shook his head. No, ma'am, it's more than that. They walked across the base together, talking about nothing and everything, finding common ground in shared experiences. Rodriguez told stories about his platoon, the personalities and conflicts and small triumphs that made up daily life in a combat zone. Alara shared carefully edited versions of her own missions, leaving out the worst parts, the memories that still woke her up at 3 in the morning. They ended up at the hangar where the A-10 sat in various stages of repair, surrounded by scaffolding and tool chests and the controlled chaos of skilled technicians doing complex work. Rodriguez stood for a long moment just looking at the aircraft, taking in every detail. I've seen A-10s before, he said finally, but never really looked at one, never appreciated what it takes to fly something like this into the kind of hell we were in. He turned to face her. The Air Force wants to retire these, right? Replace them with something newer and shinier, Alara nodded. That's the plan, has been for years. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then the Air Force is wrong, because when I needed help when my men were dying, it wasn't the new and shiny that showed up. It was you in this beat-up old plane, willing to fly into hell because we asked you to. The ceremony happened 3 weeks later, formal and official, conducted on the tarmac with a full honor guard and half the base in attendance. Alara stood at attention while a 2-star general she'd never met read a commendation that detailed her actions in the Karvesh Valley, using words like valor and heroism and selfless dedication. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the distant horizon, trying not to think about how uncomfortable the dress uniform was or how many people were watching. The general pinned the medal to her chest, shook her hand, and said something she didn't quite catch over the sound of blood rushing in her ears. There was applause. Rodriguez was there with his entire platoon, 18 soldiers standing in formation, their uniforms crisp, their bearing proud. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, they surrounded her, shaking her hand, thanking her, their words overlapping into a chorus of gratitude that she didn't know how to accept. A young private, barely old enough to buy beer, looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going home next month, getting married, starting a family. That doesn't happen without you." She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded, and that seemed to be enough. The bar was more crowded than usual that night, filled with pilots and ground crew and support personnel, all celebrating something that felt larger than a single mission. Alara found herself at the center of attention despite her best efforts to fade into the background. Someone bought her a drink, then someone else. A group of junior pilots cornered her, asking questions, wanting to know every detail, their faces eager and respectful in a way that felt foreign. She answered what she could, deflecting the more personal questions, redirecting the conversation toward tactics and training and the importance of preparation. Fletcher appeared beside her at some point, another beer in hand, his tie loosened and his usual professional demeanor slightly relaxed. "You know you're a problem now, right?" he said with a slight smile. She raised an eyebrow. "How's that?" He gestured around the room. "You've become the poster child for keeping the A-10 in service. Congress is asking questions. The press is interested. I've had 3 senators' offices call asking for briefing materials. You've single-handedly derailed 6 months of careful lobbying." Alara took a drink, considering. "Sorry about your lobbying," Fletcher laughed. "Don't be. I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's still a place for an ugly plane that refuses to die." The weeks blurred together, a mixture of training flights and media requests and quiet moments in the hangar where she could just sit with the aircraft and remember what it felt like to fly. The A-10 was fully repaired now,